All right. Happy um, full moon, first full moon after the equinox. So the energy, the third eye energy is very strong right now. The magnetic bliss in the pineal gland is very strong because you have that synchronicity, the resonance with the moon, full moon, and the equinox. And I'm just gonna do a quick review of this book. Life is short, and this is a fascinating book by Professor Dean Rickles. The cover got covered up by interlibrary loan. Here we go. And I had the Princeton University. So you gotta be impressed by Princeton University, 2022, hot off the press. And I had an interesting experience because I was fortunate enough to get a reply from Professor Rickles, because he's also a professional pianist and he's a physics, philosophy of science professor in Australia. I think he's originally from the UK, though. I'm not sure, but I think he taught in Canada before also. Not sure. Anyway, the book has a promo from Sean Carroll, who's another famous popular science physicist. And I did a Google Scholar search of Professor Dean Rickles, and I discovered that he previously did research on economics based on physics. And then his research was cited by Professor Eric Shepard, who is chaired the geography department in at University of Minnesota. And I worked with Professor Eric Shepard because he sat on the apparel committee at the University of Minnesota. So we worked on trying to get independent monitoring of the sweatshops for all the sports apparel clothing that's produced for the University of Minnesota. And so we finally got the university to join the Workers' Rights Consortium, which is a independent nonprofit that organizes boycotts of factories that have horrible slave labor conditions. And so Eric Shepard did great work to help move that along on the committee. And he kept misspelling the president's name. He kept spelling his name as Yurdoff instead of Udoff, which is pretty funny. But at any rate, I digress. Back to Professor Dean Rickles' book. And I had this strange synchronicity is when I was reading it, all of a sudden yesterday, I got this sensation. It reminded me of this author that I had read like almost a long time ago, like 18 years ago. And the only thing I could remember was he was a humanist philosopher from like the 1600s or 16th century. I couldn't remember which, so I searched that, and I got a list of names, and then I said, oh, there it is, Montaigne. It's Montaigne. So then I emailed Professor Dean Rickles, and I said, your book, he had told me that the last chapter is what he thought was the best part of the book, and that's what I would really like. And at any rate, I had emailed him that, well, from what I've read so far, it reminds me of Montaigne, but I'll keep reading. And sure enough, in the last chapter, he actually quotes Montaigne, and which is ironic because I read books all the time, and I haven't read any reference to Montaigne in any of the other books I've read. I have a whole library of books, and I literally think like maybe one of these books cites Montaigne. But at any rate, Montaigne, he's a great writer, though. He's a real, excellent classicist, humanist philosopher, smooth writing, and so this book, it's the other thing, at the end, the final chapter, he relies on Thomas Mann, the German writer, philosopher, and that reminded me of my high school senior English paper. I did it on Thomas Mann. I read The Magic Mountain, and the topic of my senior paper was that we have to confront death in order to have a meaningful life, and that's exactly what this book is about. Is that Dean Rickles argues life without death would be like playing tennis without a net. Only constraints and death make our actions meaningful. And so, for example, he cites there's this website where you can calculate how many days you have left to live if you live to like 100 years old. And it turns out, it's in like the 10,000s. So you have like, maybe like 50,000 days left, but it makes it seem like it's not that many, even if you live to be 100. But he also cites this fascinating research from the study of mice, and they found out that if you give mice like everything they need, then they stop trying. Since they have no limitations on their needs, they stop trying, and they literally just start dying off. Or was it mouse colonies raised in utopian conditions in which resources were abundant and predation was absent, although initially experiencing a stage of sustained population growth, eventually stopped reproducing and died out. Notably, toward the end of the colony's existence, the mice exhibited a number of aberrant behaviors, including autistic-like ones. Well, he does cite the DSM manual in here once also, which I think, if you read Daniel Greenberg, he's a psychologist who's critiqued the DSM manual and the whole big pharma control of psychiatry is like for example, the Nazi Hans Asperger was, he was a big Nazi and targeting children. So Professor Dean Rickles, he's not as critical of science in general as I am, of course, but he's pretty, he's open-minded. He said he's willing to consider Qigong. He's willing to look into it. I asked him about that. And he relies a lot on Jungian philosophy, but then he points out that Jung was actually against meditation and against yoga, because kind of like Freud considered it to be like a narcissistic, primitive infantilism, like being like an infant again. And which is ironic, because I had actually just sent Professor Dean Rickles this quote from from their the book he just published with Harold Ottmansbacher that I bought, but they reference how, like, when you're a baby, you lack the difference between the subject and object perception. And then Professor Dean Rickles points out that in music this is also true, because the perception of pitch in music is somewhat subjective, based on how sharp your listening skills are, and like a musician can hear tuning much better. Whereas he points out, like, if you're not a musician, you might not even be able to hear the difference between a minor third and a major third, which I find hard to believe, but I suppose, it's possible. But at any rate, I had pointed out, well, like in Daoist meditation, they have something called the immortal fetus breathing, and then I was sending him I looked up the Daoist yoga book again. It turns out they of course they clarify that this idea of a fetus is sort of, it's more like a metaphor, because I had pointed out, well, in advanced meditation, the fontanelle, the skull actually pulsates and gets soft again. The bones get soft from the chi, and the fontanelle of the skull opens up like a baby. And this is part of that immortal breathing stage. And so when I was looking up the Daoist yoga book again, I found this article. There's this article by Kenneth Cohen, and Kenneth Cohen teaches Tai Chi and Qigong, and he had promoted Chun Yilin, the teacher I trained with, and so Cohen had published a recent article on the author of the Daoist Yoga, Alchemy, and Immortality book. The martial artist Zhao Bichen, or Chao, or Zhao is the last name, and then Bichen is the first name. And so I hadn't read the article before, even though it came out like 10 years ago. But he argues that Zhao Bichen was one of the first. He considers him the fourth patriarch of Qigong, and the article goes into it turns out the term Qigong was created by the Daoist masters, because they realized that they were going to get targeted by the communists for Qigong being, anti-revolutionary or whatever, too traditional. So at any rate, the other thing is that this Zhao Bichen, his website has a couple new articles that I hadn't read yet, and about the lineage of the Neidan meditation of that book, and they state that since other people are claiming to be part of the Liu alchemy lineage, then they're, because there's this certain Western school that has been trying to claim that the Zhao Bichen school is not authentic, and so, which is of course not true at all. But so that's what Kenneth Cohen, he actually taught with people who trained with Zhao Bichen directly. There's a direct lineage from Kenneth Cohen, and any rate, the Professor Dean Rickles, I recommended to him, that Zhao Bichen website, and also some other Buddhist books in here, because he dismissed Buddhism as just sort of like trying to write off death as being sort of going into the emptiness, the void, and therefore not being a limitation, because you're going into this boundless state, and therefore you're not confronting the real limitations of life, where you have to make practical decisions, and you have to become an adult and take on responsibility. And it's very much analogous to brain development. It's like literally like brain development, because that's how the brain develops, is where it cuts off neuron connections and then it hardwires other connections. And so you're developing your character that becomes hardwired as a person as you go through puberty. And people don't realize, how important that stage of life is, because, for example, they've now proven that, if you do heavy drinking when you're a teenager, that will permanently damage the brain. It'll rewire the brain. Or if you experience trauma, like you get abused, then that's gonna hardwire your brain and mess up with your reproductive, your psychophysiology, and you'll find like the guy who was the Waco cult leader, he was abused as a child, or a lot of these like serial rapist killer types, they were abused as children, and that's just the sad truth, is that they got their brain hardwired, to be like that, because of the abused becomes the abuser. That's my phrase for it, because unfortunately that's what happens, is that. But he doesn't get into that as much. He just says that that most people are going to be in denial. Like he gets into the Jungian psychology. No matter how much parents and grandparents have sinned against the child, the man who is really adult will accept these sins as his own condition, which has to be reckoned with. Only a fool is interested in other people's guilt. He will ask himself, who am I that all this should happen to me? And this goes back to the maxim of the Delphic oracle, know thyself. So the Bill Baldry actually had a really interesting book on Socrates being something of a yogi, like a jnana yogi. because Socrates would create internal heat and bliss from his deep thinking that he did. Well, what we would assume it was thinking, but it was actually a type of samadhi, because this maxim of know thyself in the pre-Socratic philosophy, the self was actually considered to be light as being. The being as self was actually light. And so then you're turning the light around in meditation. And this is the focus of the book, The Secret of the Golden Flower, that was translated or commented on by Carl Jung. And I found it strange. He goes into a lot of Jungian philosophy, but he didn't mention The Secret of the Golden Flower. And I sent that to Professor Rickles, but he hasn't responded back about that yet. I actually don't expect to get another response from him, because it's a little bit too off into it strays too far from the Western tradition. And his argument is like, well, as Westerners, we need to confront the Western culture and, live within the conditions of the materialistic reality of like Western civilization, and otherwise we are just avoiding our condition and going into like this regressive state. But my argument is that that's actually not a proper understanding of the non-locality in quantum physics from a non-dualistic philosophy perspective, and that it's actually the opposite view, that meditation is like the hardest work you can do, and that depends on the body transformation. And this is the real teaching of Chan Buddhism in China, which is part of Mahayana Buddhism, where you have to harmonize and empty out the body as much as the mind. And that's really what the full lotus Padma Asana meditation is about, and is a body transformation as much as the mind. And so he has a chapter, Dean Rickles, Professor Dean Rickles, he's got a chapter on Dave Osprey, the bulletproofing. And you can see here, that comes up. So he's kind of making fun of, he calls Dave Osprey a rather astute businessman whose goal is to become 180 years old. And if you read Professor Rickles' endnotes, he confesses that he got wrapped up into the Dave Osprey. I called it a cult, but basically Dave Osprey, I guess he like sells this coffee or something that he encourages people to drink, fat with coffee as a fasting. And then he explains that Dave Osprey has been getting stem cell shots in covering his body with stem cells as a way of trying to defeat death. And I don't know, maybe he says, it's like, well, maybe it is working, but his attitude is that, well, there's something pathological about this approach, because you're trying to how does he explain it? He doesn't want to go into reality, because the end of it is the realization of his weakness and his mortality. And he identifies with the immortal and doesn't accept the mortal twin. So I think the issue here is, well, what is the source of the mind? Because he says here the neurotic tries to wiggle itself out of the necessity of living, wins nothing, and only burdens himself with a constant foretaste of aging and dying. So what he's saying is that by the neurotic is willing to damage their present self in order to try to achieve this future self of immortality. Now, and this was kind of included in his critique of Jung being against meditation, because the idea was, well, if you consider the time it takes to meditate, then that's depriving yourself from the necessary commitment needed, to be a mature adult where you're doing actual work in society, productive work. And so I asked Professor Dean Rickles if he had read Olivier Costa de Beauregard's book, Time, A Physical Magnitude, because Professor Rickles, he mentions in the book how there's this age-old debate in Western science whether time is actually real or not. Does time actually exist on its own? And of course, Olivier Costa de Beauregard, he not only does he argue that time exists, but that the truth of reality is actually precognitive, that the source of reality is based on precognition. And Professor Dean Rickles, he does cite and discuss Roger Penrose's cosmology, and where time does exist, and that there's this asymmetric time to the universe based on the photon. So if all of matter eventually returns to being photons through the black hole singularities, then in the end of the universe, there's no space-time experienced by the photons, and therefore the truth of the universe is in this fifth dimension, what Penrose calls fundamental time, that doesn't have any sense of size because it's just pure photons. And this is literally also gets into the age of the universe, because the age of the universe is relative to the rest frame that's measuring it. And so if you are relying on meditation, where your mind is actually the pure spirit or biophotons, coherent biophotons at the speed of light, then actually when you're turning the light around, you're accessing this superluminal resonance that Roger Penrose gets into. And so I sent Professor Dean Rickles the recent talk by Roger Penrose, where he's at the Science of Consciousness conference, where Nobel physicist Roger Penrose is using the example of a pianist to argue that a professional pianist actually is relying on precognition, because their perception of time is due to quantum coherence that's superluminal. And so this is basically the secret of meditation, as well as Stuart Hameroff argues, along with his work with Roger Penrose. So you have this, by increasing the frequency of the light inside of you, then you're able to also increase this time reversed negative frequency signal. And I had my meditation going on in the background. Just wondering what that noise was. So, of course, this is a bit too, far out for most of standard physics to consider. And also, so this idea that the truth of reality is not this lonely ego as individuation, but actually it's this non-local proto-consciousness, what Roger Penrose calls proto-consciousness, is this formless awareness. And so when I was reading the latest from the Daoist yoga school of Neidan, the Zhao Bichen lineage from the Dragon Gate Daoism, it turns out his teachers that initiated him into Daoism were actually Chan Buddhists. And so it turns out that they didn't actually teach the Daoist methods until a student first achieved the Chan Buddhist enlightenment through the mind meditation. So you sit in full lotus, and so you have the body transformation as well, but you're not relying on visualization to empty out your body to a deeper level, but you're just relying on the using the mind as the source of the source of the light, by turning the light around internally, and then listening to the source of the light as the source of the emptiness, the formless awareness, as this eternal process. And only once you achieve the absolute void, which is the ability to see light externally outside of your body, so not just seeing light when your eyes are closed, but seeing auras and spirits, and only then do you achieve the foundation, which then enables you to then start to empty out the body and achieve the supreme, what they call supreme complete enlightenment in Mahayana Buddhism, which is where you don't just open up the third eye, but you have a deep heart awakening, and then you can go even further. That's called emptying out the seventh level of consciousness in Mahayana Buddhism. And then to empty out the eighth level of consciousness is also to empty out the first 5 level of consciousness of the body. And and so this is like, this isn't even recognized in Western philosophy of science or psychology. It's in quantum biology, it would be possible to consider this, as I have done. I've gone into the research of it'd be like basically taking Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose's research to a deeper level, and so from the perspective of this non-dualism that you then access through the enlightenment experience, then you enter in this holographic reality where the individual is inherently interactive as what in Buddhism is called interdependent origination. And so this is the truth. The true meaning of emptiness is not just this nihilistic boundlessness, but it's actually this eternal engagement with the truth of reality as an interactive holographic. Since all of matter originates from light, then it's based on the gravitational mass of light originating from this negative entropy as a time-reversed negative frequency signal that's accessed through the non-commutative algebra. And this is what Professor Dean Rickles' other book with Harold Ottmansbacher is what I had reviewed previously. And I haven't finished reading that book, but that book is split up into sections. So they start out with based on Jung, and then they get into John Wheeler, but then he mentions John Wheeler in this book also. So you can see the two books are related because he's sort of expounding on his work with Harold Ottmansbacher and so this is what like Slavoj Žižek, he also tries to dismiss Buddhism as like this attempt to achieve a sense of balance that doesn't exist. But this is like a new age, what the new age is trying to do or whatever, like this eternal harmony that's never existed. But see, what that is actually a psychological projection of a Western Platonic philosophy where time is defined inherently as a symmetric spatial balance. And so you'll see this like even when Daoism is translated back into English, they'll even Daoist masters will use that word balance. But that's not what really is going on, because if you really study Daoism, the truth is actually this eternal motion that, of course, in the terms of Buddhism, it's based on the logical paradox of neither this nor that, or as Eddie Oceans called it, neither a nor not a, in terms of quantum logic. And so Eddie Oceans, the physicist working at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, realized the secret of Neidan as internal martial arts is actually due to the non-commutativity as a quantum logic. So you have this inherent asymmetry of time and frequency. And so it's the exact opposite of trying to think that there's just this boundless balance to reality, because your spiritual ego is based on the light, but the emptiness is always resonating light as the absolute void. And so there will eternally be this engagement or interaction with the self as light, and then its source in the future as a harmonization with the past. And so when you meditate, you're consciously resonating with that source of the light by turning the light around internally through a listening process. And so when people try to dismiss non-Western meditation as being, childlike and primitive. This is actually just a psychological projection of the Platonic philosophy that assumes this symmetric spatial mathematics. And so there's the Zhao Bichen lineage from the Dragon Gate, the Chan Buddhist. He was trying to utilize Western science, modern science, to explain Qigong or meditation. But at the same time, he was also relying on this traditional Daoist philosophy. And one of the things I didn't realize that another new article on that lineage website is the fact that when you read his training manual, the Daoist yoga book, it's 16 chapters. And it turns out that you're actually supposed to be reading the I Ching at the same time, and that each chapter can then be split into 4 parts as 64. 16 times 4 is 64. And then that will enable you to use the I Ching to guide your alchemical training. And I didn't know. I mean, the Kenneth Cohen, he makes this point where if you look at the terminology that the Zhao Bichen is using, it's very much based on the I Ching, because it's relying on the symbols of fire and water. And so in fact, this is very fascinating, because Qigong master Chun-Yi Lin actually told Jim Nance to read the I Ching, Qigong master Jim Nance. And, as a Westerner, I wanted to dismiss this as just sort of like New Age hocus pocus, because the I Ching, it's like a divination book, it's sort of like tarot cards or something. I mean, I understand the philosophy of the I Ching is very much based on Daoism, but I didn't realize that there's a direct correlation between the actual structure of the training manual, the Daoist yoga training manual, having the 16 chapters, and at one of my classes in 2000, I had the book with me in the class, and then in my backpack, and then Qigong master Chun-Yi Lin was describing his meditation at the time, and he said it was like you can see the snow falling in the summertime or something like that. And there was a direct quote from the Daoist yoga book that I had in my backpack. And it's the advanced stage right before you produce the Yang Shen, which is another like bilocation of the golden Yang Shen, another physical body, which of course is difficult for us to believe. But if we realize that all matter originates from light, then our experience of being in this physical reality is actually a type of holograph. And so we can actually reproduce that through deep meditation, so that all your senses are reproduced through this quantum non-locality, the formlessness. And it's really only quantum biology that gets into that a bit, but of course not quite on the level of the deep level of yoga meditation. And So this is the Dean Rickles book. In terms of like Western philosophy, I found, it's a really fascinating book that I don't really agree with it, but you can see the Western perspective very well. You can see that he's engaged. Like he says, individuation is a process of leaving whatever safe zone you might think you have constructed for yourself, mitigating all risks. It can lead to quite significant disassembly of the self if one has enough defenses operating. At the extreme end, some have become their package of defenses, overlapping with a false creation presented to the world to protect them from it. And we turn to this issue in chapter 7. So that's the bulletproofing. And I thought that bulletproofing chapter was definitely fascinating because that's like captures a whole sort of like market. This he points out even the word hacking is a transhumanist term where you're seeing your brain like a machine, your body and your mind are like a machine, and that he himself fell into that trap in his own experimenting with the bulletproofing marketing cult, as I called it a cult, but I know that that's an extreme. I'm just using euphemism. It's sort of a joke, hyperbole. He mentions Weinberg. Now, I didn't know he actually co-wrote a book with Weinberg also, I think. So he gets into, he says out, finding a superstring theory would not provide an account of meaning. And so his point, comprehending the role of humanity in the universe leads us to the very opposite conclusion to Weinberg, the anti-Copernican one that Roger Penrose stated quite clearly. A world without humans really is pointless. And so in other words, that our consciousness is definitely a part of our physics understanding of the world. And so that was where like his embrace of Roger Penrose is really what I got. That was the big positive thing that I got out of the book. And of course that leads to Basil J. Hiley, who worked with Penrose, and their other book really promotes Basil J. Hiley. So it's definitely got a lot going for it. This is definitely a fascinating book. It's a smooth read. There's definitely some deep thinking going on. And so he quotes the I Ching a lot. The individual attains significance as a free spirit only by surrounding himself with these limitations and by determining for himself what his duty is. So I'm just gonna leave it at that. And thanks for letting me ramble about Professor Dean Rickles' book and related topics.